Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're hopping on a historical time machine and setting the dial for July 21st, 1861. Our destination, a little creek in northern Virginia called Bull Run. This wasn't just any skirmish. This was the American Civil War's very first major land battle, the one that was supposed to be a quick, decisive affair. In fact, people were so sure of a swift Union victory that they literally packed picnics and came to watch. So grab your popcorn, maybe a cucumber sandwich, because we are about to see how a confident Sunday outing turned into a national reality check. Imagine this. It's a hot July morning just outside Washington, D.C. The air is buzzing, not just with insects, but with anticipation. Carriages packed with the city's elite congressmen, senators, socialites are rolling up the road to Centreville. They've brought champagne on ice, fancy picnic baskets, and even opera glasses to get a better view of the action. The general consensus was that these Southern rebels, these upstarts, would be taught a swift lesson. The Union Army would march down, fire a few shots, the Confederates would scatter, and everyone would be home in time for dinner. It was supposed to be a spectacle, a grand display of federal power. The war would be over before it really even began. Spoilers: the champagne got warm, and the only thing that scattered was the crowd. The man tasked with delivering this quick victory was Union General Irvin McDowell. McDowell was an interesting character. He was known more for his gourmet cooking and his chronic stomach problems than for his battlefield prowess. He was a meticulous planner, a man who hated rushing things. And his army, it was made up mostly of 90-day volunteers, men who had signed up for a short stint, thinking this whole rebellion thing would be a brief adventure. They were green, inexperienced, and barely knew how to march in a straight line, let alone fight a pitched battle. McDowell knew this. He pleaded with President Lincoln for more time to train his men, to whip them into a respectable fighting force. But the political pressure was immense. The newspapers were screaming for action. The public was impatient, and Lincoln, feeling the heat, basically told McDowell, "The volunteers' enlistments are expiring. You are green. It is true, but they are green also. You are all green alike." So, with a heavy heart and probably a churning stomach, McDowell sighed and marched his 35,000 men out of Washington. Waiting for them across Bull Run were the Confederates, commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard. If McDowell was a cautious gourmet, Beauregard was a flamboyant peacock. A Creole from Louisiana, he was famous for his dramatic flair, his cleverly detailed, often overly complex battle plans, and his love of a good-looking uniform. He had become the South's first hero after capturing Fort Sumter. Now, he was tasked with defending Virginia. But he wasn't alone. In a remarkable feat of 19th-century logistics, another Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston was moving by rail from the Shenandoah Valley to reinforce, ready to lead the charge. Think about that, coordinating two entire armies without phones, without email, just couriers on horseback and a clicking telegraph. It was a logistical gamble that would pay off spectacularly. The stage was set. Two armies, full of amateur soldiers, led by professional but very different generals, were about to collide. As the sun climbed higher, the day turned blisteringly hot. McDowell's plan was actually pretty solid. On paper, he would send a large part of his army on a long, looping march to cross Bull Run upstream and hit the Confederate left flank. It was a classic flanking maneuver, designed to roll up the enemy line. Problem. Executing a complex plan with inexperienced troops is like trying to herd cats. The Union soldiers, clad in their brand-new, stiflingly hot wool uniforms, got tangled up in the woods. They were slow, they got lost, and the element of surprise evaporated under the sweltering Virginia sun. Maps were hard and the terrain was unforgiving. The Union attack kicked off around mid-morning, despite the delays. The Federal troops pushed across the creek at Sudley Springs and began driving back the Confederate defenders. For a while, it looked like the picnicors might get their show after all. The Union advance was steady, and the rebel lines started to waver. The fighting swirled around a key piece of high ground known as Henry House Hill. And it is here we meet one of the battle's most tragic figures, Judith Carter Henry. She was an 85-year-old, bedridden widow who lived in a small house right on top of the hill. As the battle raged around her home, her family tried to move her to safety, but she insisted on staying in her own bed. It was a fatal decision. Her house was caught in the crossfire, and a Union artillery shell crashed through the wall, mortally wounding her. Judith Henry became the first civilian casualty of the American Civil War, a grim symbol that this conflict would not spare anyone, soldier or citizen. By early afternoon, the Confederate line was on the verge of breaking completely. Fleeing rebel soldiers were streaming back in disarray. It seemed like the Union victory was just moments away. But then, on the reverse slope of Henry House Hill, a brigade of Virginians stood firm. They were commanded by a former professor from the Virginia Military Institute, a deeply religious and somewhat eccentric man named Thomas Jackson. While other units were collapsing, Jackson's men held their ground, presenting an unyielding line to the Union advance. Another Confederate general, Bernard B., trying to rally his own broken troops, pointed towards Jackson's brigade. The exact words are lost to history, but the sentiment was clear. He shouted something like, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer." Some historians argue B was actually frustrated, meaning, look at Jackson just standing there like a stone wall. Why isn't he helping us? But it doesn't matter. History took it as a compliment. A legend was born in that moment of chaos. Thomas Jackson would forever be known as Stonewall Jackson, and his brigade would become the famous Stonewall Brigade. That moment changed everything. Jackson's stand fired up the Confederates. Johnston's reinforcements, fresh off the trains, began arriving on the battlefield at the perfect time, extending and strengthening the Confederate line. The momentum of the battle shifted dramatically. The Union soldiers, who had been marching and fighting for hours in the oppressive heat, were exhausted. Their initial enthusiasm had curdled into fatigue and fear. The Confederate counterattack, a wild, screaming charge that would become known as the Rebel Yell, crashed into the weary Federal lines. The Union soldiers, many of whom had never experienced anything like this, broke. What started as an orderly retreat quickly devolved into a panicked rout. Back on the hillsides overlooking the battle, the picnic crowd suddenly realized the red they were seeing through their opera glasses wasn't wine. The distant pops and puffs of smoke were not a fireworks display. Tease was real. It was bloody, and it was coming right at them. Panic erupted. The very same road the Union Army had marched down so confidently that morning became a scene of absolute chaos. Fleeing soldiers, terrified civilians in their fine carriages, congressmen on horseback, supply wagons. Everyone was trying to get back to Washington at the same time. Carriages overturned, blocking the road and creating the world's worst traffic jam. A congressman was even briefly captured by Confederate cavalry. The confident spectacle had turned into a humiliating, chaotic stampede. It was a mad dash for safety, a frantic scramble back to the Capitol, leaving behind rifles, cannons, and the illusion of a short, glorious war. Back in Washington, President Lincoln was waiting for news. He spent the day at the telegraph office, getting fragmented updates. Early reports were positive, suggesting a Union victory. But as evening fell, the messages grew ominous. Then, a telegram arrived with the devastating truth. The army was in full retreat. Lincoln was reportedly eating dinner when he received the final confirmation of the disaster. He calmly put down his fork. The dream of a 90-day war was dead. The defeat at Bull Run was a brutal, humbling lesson. It shattered the North's overconfidence and forced its leaders to confront the grim reality that this would be a long, bloody, and difficult struggle. Lincoln quietly fired the fantasy of a quick resolution and began the serious, long-term work of building a real army and finding generals who could lead it. And so, the first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as the Confederates called it, come to an end. It was a messy, amateurish affair on both sides, a clash of two unprepared armies. But its impact was profound. For the South, it was a tremendous morale boost, confirming their belief in their martial superiority. For the North, it was a wake-up call of the harshest kind. One dusty Sunday, one shattered illusion. The nation now understood the true cost of war. If you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear the echo of it, the frantic spinning of carriage, wheels in the dark, the shouts of panicked men, and the quiet, heavy realization that the road ahead would be very long indeed. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history. See you next time.